Hi, I'm Iain Mcilwee and I'm Chief Executive of FIS, Finishing Interior Sector, the trade association for the fit out, finishing and interior sector, which is around £10 billion of the construction sector. I mean, the core packages within that are dry lining, carpentry and joinery, ceiling fixing, SFS installation. Really, we're the people that turn structures into homes, hospitals, hotels and schools. I don't think the industry's ever been under more pressure than it is right now. The labour shortage, I think, is probably the most critical and difficult area for us to cope with. It's such a complex issue because it's based on a number of overlapping situations that have all happened and come together to create this nadir that we face at the moment. So, we've had the hiatus of COVID and the impact of availability that's had on people. So you've had this sort of stop-start of all of a sudden a team of 5 people might not be available because they all have to isolate. So we've had that sort of erratic process, which is very difficult to manage in construction when you're on such tight timelines. But the big backdrop has been Brexit and the immigration change, so changes to immigration rules. So if I look at, say, a trade package like dry lining, so probably one of the biggest footprints in our sector, about 60,000 people in the UK do dry lining, whether they be fixing, boarding and finishing, the 3 sort of core sub-trades of dry lining. Now, going into 2020, round about 40% of that workforce were EU workers. So 24,000 of our 60,000 were EU workers. We need roughly, to keep that 60,000 level, we need roughly 1,200 people a year to come into the sector. So that's our natural churn. So because of retirement and people leaving for other reasons, we need 1,200 a year to come in. Previously, 600 of those, give or take, came from the EU. So if you think about it in numeric terms, 1,200 people doesn't sound like a lot of people. But actually, when you've got to double what you did in terms of national recruitment, that's quite difficult. And then you have to remember, in that 24,000, not all of them have decided to stay. I think official figures would suggest that somewhere between 10 or 15% of those have disappeared. And I think part of that was because it wasn't such a binary market as we first thought. People didn't necessarily settle here. They came here for a few months, they went home again, they came here for a few months. It was a much more transient workforce. And as a consequence of that 24,000, if we take 10% as to keep the numbers simple, 10% of that 24,000 is 2,400 people that we're missing. Put that in the context of our 1,200 annual recruitment rate, and we've got to find another 2 years worth of people in the short term. It takes roughly 18 months to train up a dry liner. So you can see the challenge that creates at the core of our industry. We're short people. We're very short people. When we look at the reasons for that, there is a backdrop. We haven't trained enough. We haven't had a strong enough culture for training, largely because we've been able to rely on supply from other areas. So we haven't necessarily had to do as much to train our domestic workforce because we've been able to rely on that immigration to prop us up. So obviously, with that being taken away so quickly, it's very difficult. But I also think that the construction process isn't helping us now. We've become very commoditized as a sector, construction, and we treat relationships in a very disposable way. And we've started to compete very aggressively, not just on price, but on time. And as a consequence, the process has become very fast. So the average time that a dry liner is given in terms of notice starting on a project is about 6 weeks. The norm, so the median, is about 3 weeks. So we're looking at 3 weeks notice to start a job on a building that's taken probably, could even be years. I think some buildings it's 8 years to plan, yet we're giving 3 weeks notice on a job. So as a consequence, there's this rush to get boots on site. In the meantime, we've got the backdrop of Grenfell and the changes that's been made in terms of understanding of design responsibility. So we've seen design responsibility squeezing down the supply chain. We've got this time pressure to get boots on site. And as a consequence, everything's starting to become a bit of a rush at the end of the job. And think about where finishing sits. The building's been, I say, some buildings it's 8 years. Everybody else's program's gone on the wonk. And by the time we arrive on the site, people are trying to make back time. They're trying to make back money that maybe has been lost elsewhere in the job. So the pressure is immense. And I think, unfortunately, at times we're running a little bit too quickly. So some of the research we've done, the impact of this, is at the moment, the average level of rework within a dry lining package is round about 17%. So call it 20% for the sake of this. So if we're saying 17%, 20% of our work is rework, that's putting up walls to take them down at a time when we've got a huge, immense, never bigger labour crisis. So 25% of our labour is messing around doing work that we don't need. And think of all the unintended consequences of that. Because labour is short, we stockpile labour. So the job's going to be starting in a couple of days, but we can't afford to release anybody, because if we do, they'll go off and do work on other sites. We might not be able to get them back again. So we end up stockpiling labour within jobs. So the waste isn't just the waste in terms of labour, the waste in terms of material. It is more profound than that. So really, for me, that labour crisis is right at the cusp of everything we're doing, and it is a result of we are to an extent accountable as a sector by not having built that training infrastructure that we need, but at the same time we're a little bit victim of the commoditisation of construction, and there's a huge amount of waste that's being allowed to carry on, and we can't change because it's not just us that we talk about in FIS. We often talk about the I, we, they of change. I can do this much, but collectively we need to behave slightly differently, and we definitely need them to do other things, or we really can't move beyond this vortex that we're stuck in. One of the things that we really need to get better at as a construction sector is understanding our data. We talk at the FIS a lot about data-led change. We found it particularly difficult at the centre to measure productivity collectively, because people are doing it in lots of different ways, and the information isn't always at hand. So we ask the question, the format we need it in isn't the format other people have it in, and it becomes very difficult to crunch the numbers. So I think actually really starting to interrogate the numbers and understanding where the causes of waste are is fundamental to evolution within our sector. I mean, some of the numbers we do know is, if we look at that rework figure again, 17% rework, if we look at some of the numbers behind that, we know that 2% of our members are never asked to start on site without correct design details. That's a concerning number when you think about that. And ultimately that leads to waste, because they're building the wrong stuff because they haven't had the right information. I suspect if we really dig into it, we're going to find that its program issues are more common. And again, I think I mentioned earlier that because we're at the end of the job, you're often trying to save time within the finishing packages. And then as a consequence, trades could be tripping over each other a little bit, or the site, you may not have unfettered access to site, or the curtain wall might have been put up and you can't get your material in, so you've got to load out in different ways. So it becomes quite complicated. In the programming and construction is probably the most complicated part of it all. And it's such an interconnected and complex industry. We do need to get better at that. I don't want to be all doom and gloom though, because I think there's lots of hope on the horizon. I think one of the things we are seeing is that as we digitalise construction, and that is happening regardless of what other reports say, we're seeing a lot more digital technology starting to support construction. That relies on a certain amount of consistency, and that digitalisation is driving some consistency in the way that data is being collected and managed. I'm not sure we've wholly worked out what we're going to do with it all yet, and I'm not sure all the companies with digital information necessarily understand the power of the data that they have yet, but the data is starting to be collected. So I think managing our data and understanding productivity in that sort of more numerical sense is quite important. One of the problems in construction is that we exist too much within the project. So construction is very project-led, and if you think about that, you think about why. It's because the relative size of the projects are always big relative to the size of the companies. They're big investments. So, people making construction investments, they're big investments, and they're almost too big to fail. And that's why sometimes construction can be sort of shy to innovate or seemingly shy to innovate, because wholesale change is quite scary in the context of these big projects. And even if you think about it, if you break it even down to domestic, if you have your side extension, it's a lot of money to you. It might not be a lot of money in the whole economy, but it's a lot of money to you. So I think sort of innovating in that environment is quite difficult. And I think therein is sort of a big challenge, is how do we step outside of the project and invest over a period. I've heard John Waterman at Wilmot Dixon express this better than this, and he talks about the infinite game, where you've got, if you live project to project to project, you live in a finite world. How do you become an infinite business that steps outside of the project and engenders and enables collaboration with that wider sector outside the individual project? Because what I see when I look at construction is a fabulously innovative, an amazing, awe-inspiring sector, right? But so much of that innovation is solving problems in the job. And we don't leave ourselves much time, resource, and energy because of the procurement processes and the fact we've got to quote lean, we've got to quote lean on price, we've got to quote lean on money, that we don't really leave ourselves much left. So we talk about the veneer of business over the well of the contractor. And actually, we do need to fatten those businesses up and find ways to invest and collaborate outside of the project. Again, it's not all doom and gloom, because some things are now working in our favour. We've got material shortages, logistical issues. The challenge of working in a global economy has probably never been understood more than in the past few months, when we've had huge issues around shipping containers going up by ridiculous percentages, and material prices going up by the high inflation environment, something we've never really had to deal with. Not in my lifetime in construction. It's always been relatively low inflation, but that sort of availability of material and availability of labour means that you actually have to plan a little bit better, and you need to have more trusted relationships as well, because you need to trust people to deliver. So as a consequence, you need to trust that if people say they can get material on site, if people say they can get labour on site, that they can do it. So potentially this is driving more loyalty in the relationships that we're seeing within the supply chain. And where we can be sort of quite wasteful at times in construction, we often operate with very disposable relationships as well. Our default position is, if somebody does it wrong, if a contractor does it wrong, sack them, get the next one in. There's loads of others out there that can do the job, rather than let's get that contractor in, let's work out why that problem happened, and let's work out it never happens with them again. And that way, actually, you start to sort of drive investment, you start to drive change, and particularly if people can see beyond the end of that project to the next 5, then all of a sudden you can invest a little bit now, because you might lose money on the first job, but the next 4 are going to pay it back. So I think as we start to sort of develop those, we talk about collaboration. We don't see as much of it as we'd like to, but we talk to the Construction Leadership Council, the conversation starting. It's starting to filter through the business, and it's starting to be driven by necessity. So my hope is we're at a little bit of a tipping point, and actually those better loyal relationships are starting to happen in pockets of the industry. Well, I think managing a high inflation environment is something we've all had to adapt to. I mean, the key things are to make sure that we're being very. I think what people are finding difficult is that they've always had sort of time limits on quotes, but now they actually have to enforce them. And I think the important thing is that people are realistic. One of the things that always worries me about construction is we don't cost. Risk is something that construction. I've worked in construction for 20 odd years now, and I don't think when I started in construction we talked about risk enough. At the moment we're talking about risk all the time, but I still don't think we fully price risk into our jobs. And I think in a high inflation environment it's really important that we start to price risk, because you can very easily catch a cold if the project runs away from you. I mean, my hope is that we're through the worst of it in terms of inflation, but obviously the conflict in Russia has thrown things into a little bit more uncertainty, and whilst we're used to dealing with uncertainty, it's still a worrying time. Oh, I think it's really difficult. I mean, there's no easy way. If prices are going up, we need to be factoring that into our estimates. We need to make sure that when we're quoting for jobs, that we can secure the labour and materials that we need, because it's not just the cost of the job. I mean, there's three big risks in construction. There's design risk, there's price risk, and there's time risk. Okay, they're the three big risks that hit the construction sector. Now, you know, Grenfell, all three of those, I think, are more difficult to manage today than they were 20 years ago. So, design risk, say, because of Grenfell, because of the lack of trust, and because of a justified scrutiny of all information, we're starting to find areas that are a little bit grey. And in the past, that would have just been, well, it should be all right, just crack on. Whereas now we're looking for that piece of paper that gives us the confidence. In many cases, that piece of paper is a test report. In some cases, it's a contractual clause which says it's not my fault. And I think we are seeing an element of that where design risk is being pushed through the supply chain, and we're starting to see creep into specialist subcontract contracts, design development, design checking clauses, which puts additional pressure and potentially puts additional risk into that contract. It certainly puts additional risk into that contract. And again, if there's a problem with the design and you're responsible for design development, the time risk, it's not just that design risk. There's a safety risk, there's a quality risk there, of course there is. There's also a time risk that starts to creep in. So we talk about design risk, we talk about time risk. If you're responsible for delays, the liquidated damages build up very quickly in construction. So again, you've got to be very cognizant and aware of the risks around that. And then, of course, price risk is the inflation and things running away from you in that time. So if things are running late, you can't secure the material, you can't store the material. And again, one of the other things that always worries me in a time like this is people tend to stockpile and store. And that's great in terms of fixing prices, but it also adds another element of risk, because if that stuff is spoiled when it's stored, that can have pretty serious consequences. So you've got to make sure you pay attention to the storage requirements and that it's properly covered by your insurance, because again, that's something that we have seen can cause real problems. I think we talked about digital investment. I think one of the other things that possibly happened through COVID is that we started to become a little bit more open to labour saving ideas. So, where there has been a little bit of machismo in construction, and you didn't need to use the manually handling aids because you're big and you're strong. I think we are starting to see more acceptance of those kind of things. And I think we're also, Jamie talks about the labour shortage. In the wake of a labour shortage, we have to think more seriously about well-being and occupational health. With construction has been brilliant in terms of the way that's improved health and safety, or sort of safety. I'm not sure we've been as good in the health arena. And if we are requiring people to lug big heavy things around big distances, we're requiring them to make repeated hand-arm movements that over time will build up strain. I think there is more cognizance of the importance of ensuring that, particularly in the wake of a labour shortage, that we're looking after people better. So I think that sort of automation and manual handling support and being more productive with the use of tools is an area that there's a lot more. I think we're a lot more open to, and one of the things we do at FIS meetings now, and we have working groups that look at different packages within the fit out finishing world, and we quite like a show and tell, where people bring stuff along. Because we're a very practical industry, so people can have a go at it, people can have a feel of it, and I think that's part of what people enjoy about our meetings. I've never seen a group of people happier than when they're playing with an exoskeleton. It's just people in this industry tend to love what they do, and some of the tools and gadgets that are coming through that are helping us do it better are quite exciting. One of the things that I find frustrating about working in construction is that we're often given panacea solutions. So, we talk about modern methods of construction. That's going to fix all of our problems. And modern methods of construction is often sounds like to me something that other people are going to do to us that make us redundant. So it's all about offsite. It's all about structure, offsite structures and building everything in a factory and then bringing that to site and assembling it. Now, I'm not a Luddite, and I do believe that more will be done off-site. But in order to really improve the efficiency of the construction sector, we need to look at the construction site more like a factory. And we need to think about modernising the processes within construction. We need to talk about modernising methods of construction. And if you think about it in terms of footprint terms, the construction site is a pretty efficient place to build stuff because that's where the stuff's going to be, right? So if we had to build factories to build every building, we're going to have more factories than buildings, right? So it is efficient in terms of footprint as a place to get stuff built. Now, I get concerned about this conversation about modern methods of construction because it's almost like a stick to beat the industry with. You've got to move to modern methods of construction, and then people get angry because people who feel that it's going to replace them aren't getting excited about it. It just seems like a bizarre conversation. So moving to modernising methods of construction is our preferred approach, but you can't do that until you talk about modern methods of procurement. And I think one of the pieces of research we're doing this year, which I'm hoping is going to be seminal, it's certainly going to help move the conversation on, is that we're working with Reading University and Barber ABI as research partners. And we're looking to pull together information about procurement, effectively with the exam question, is what's become normal now tenable? And how is that norm affecting our ability to deliver? We talk about faster, better, greener for construction, but can you really have better and greener at the moment and faster? Because I think the analogy somebody told me once was Abraham Lincoln's famous quote: "If you give me 6 weeks to chop down a tree, I'll spend 4 weeks sharpening my axe." Well, that's great, but we have got a specified time period of 6 weeks there. Somebody's allowed him the 4 weeks to sharpen his axe. In construction, we've got 6 weeks. We'll faff around for 5 of them. In the last week, we'll chuck somebody an axe. We'll send them off into the wood, and we might not even tell them which tree to chop down. So I think we need to actually look at our procurement process. So this piece of research, and the one thing I want to reassure everybody about, FIS is a supply chain organisation. We've got manufacturing, we've got distribution, we've got main contractors, we've got specialist subcontractors in our membership. So we do represent the supply chain. So we're not doing this to try and pass blame. Now, the I, we, they of change is so important to the way that we see construction moving forward. We talk about empathy-led change. We talk about data-led change. And that's what we're trying to get through this research, is a better understanding and better data around the process. And my sort of appeal to everybody really is fill it in. You're going to get a questionnaire, it'll take you a few minutes to fill in. Give us your data, because that data is going to be crunched by real industry experts like at Reading University and in Barber, and it's going to be built up around a load of qualitative research, studies, interviews as well, that are taking place with some key people from across our sector. And what we want to do is put it all together, define normal, and then start to build out from there. So data-led change, empathy-led change, and that piece of research I think is going to be so important to this. So my plea is, if everybody gets it, they fill it in, please.